Welcome to Knowledge Valley. Globalization refers to an economic system that has emerged in the last 50 years or so. But the making of the global world has a long history of trade, of migration, of people in search of work, the movement of capital, and much else. From ancient times, travelers, traders, priests, and pilgrims traveled vast distances for knowledge, opportunity, and spiritual fulfillment, or to escape persecution. As early as 3000 BCE, an active coastal trade linked the Indus Valley civilizations with present-day West Asia. Silk routes link the world. Silk routes are a good example of vibrant pre-modern trade and cultural links between distant parts of the world. Several silk routes have been identified by historians over land and sea, connecting vast regions of Asia and linking Asia with Europe and Northern Africa. In exchange for textiles and species from India, precious metals, gold and silver, flowed from Europe to Asia. Food travels, spaghetti and potato. Food offers many examples of long-distance cultural exchange. New crops were introduced by traders and travelers. Ready foodstuff such as noodles traveled west from China to become spaghetti. Our ancestors were not familiar with common foods such as potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes, and so on about 5 centuries ago. Many of our common foods came from America's original inhabitants, the American Indians. Conquest, disease, and trade. The Indian Ocean, for centuries before, had known a bustling trade, with goods, people, knowledge, customs, etc., crisscrossing its waters. The entry of Europeans helped redirect these flows towards Europe. America's vast lands and abundant crops and minerals began to transform, trade, and live everywhere. The Portuguese and Spanish conquest and colonization of America were decisively underway by the mid-16th century. Europeans' most powerful weapon was not a conventional military weapon, but germs such as those of smallpox that they carried on their person. It proved to be a deadly killer. Until the 19th century, poverty and hunger were common in Europe. Until well into the 18th century, China and India were among the world's richest countries. However, from the 15th century, China is said to have restricted overseas contacts and retreated into isolation. Europe now emerged as the center of world trade. The 19th century, 1815-1914, In the 19th century, economic, political, social, cultural, and technological factors interacted in complex ways to transform societies and reshape external relations. 3 flows or movements were identified by economists. The first is the flow of trade, referred largely to trading goods like cloth or wheat. The second is the flow of labor, the migration of people in search of employment. And the third is the movement of capital for short-term or long-term investments over long distances. In the 19th century, self-sufficiency in food meant lower living standards and social conflict in Britain. This happened because of population growth from the late 18th century. Corn laws were imposed, which means restrictions on the import of corn. British agriculture was unable to compete with imports, and vast areas of land were left uncultivated. So, Thousands of men and women flocked to the cities or migrated overseas. In Britain, food prices fell, and in the mid-19th century, industrial growth led to higher incomes and more food imports. To fulfill British demand in Eastern Europe, Russia, America, and Australia, lands were cleared to expand food production. Linking railways to agricultural fields and building homes for people required capital and labor. London helped in terms of finance, and people emigrated from Europe to America and Australia in the 19th century. By 1890, a global agricultural economy had taken shape, adapting to complex changes in labor movement patterns, capital flows, ecologies, and technology. In West Punjab, the British Indian government built a network of irrigation canals to transform semi-desert wastes into fertile agricultural lands to grow wheat and cotton for export. Even the cultivation of cotton expanded worldwide to feed British textile mills. Some of the important inventions in the field of technology are the railways, steamships, and the telegraph, which transformed the 19th century world. But technological advances were often the result of larger social, political, and economic factors. For example, colonization stimulated new investments and improvements in transport. Faster railways, lighter wagons, and larger ships helped move food more cheaply and quickly from faraway farms to final markets. Animals were also shipped live from America to Europe till the 1870s. Meat was considered an expensive luxury beyond the reach of the European poor. To break the earlier monotony of bread and potatoes, many could now add meat, butter, and eggs to their diet. Late 19th century colonialism. Trade flourished and markets expanded in the late 19th century. But it has a darker side too, as in many parts of the world, the expansion of trade and a closer relationship with the world economy meant a loss of freedoms and livelihoods. In 1885, the big European powers met in Berlin to complete the carving up of Africa between them. Britain and France made vast additions to their overseas territories. Belgium and Germany became new colonial powers. The US also became a colonial power in the late 1890s by taking over some colonies earlier held by Spain. Rinderpest, or the cattle plague. In Africa, in the 1890s, a fast-spreading disease of cattle plague impacted people's livelihoods and the local economy. Africa had abundant land and a relatively small population. In the late 19th century, Europeans were attracted to Africa due to its vast resources of land and minerals. Europeans came to Africa hoping to establish plantations and mines to produce crops and minerals for export to Europe. But there was an unexpected problem: a shortage of labor willing to work for wages. Inheritance laws were changed, and according to the new one, only one member of a family was allowed to inherit the land. In the late 1880s, Rinderpest arrived in Africa, carried by infected cattle imported from British Asia to feed the Italian soldiers invading Eritrea in East Africa. The loss of cattle destroyed African livelihoods. Indentured labor migration from India. Indentured labor illustrates the two-sided nature of the 19th century world, a world of faster economic growth as well as great misery, higher incomes for some and poverty for others, technological advances in some areas and new forms of coercion in others. In India, indentured laborers were hired under contracts, and most of them came from the present-day regions of eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, central India, and the dry districts of Tamil Nadu. Indian indentured migrants' main destinations were the Caribbean islands, mainly Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, Mauritius, and Fiji. Indentured workers were also recruited for tea plantations in Assam. 19th century indenture has been described as a new system of slavery. In Trinidad, the annual Muharram procession was transformed into a riotous carnival called Hosei, in which workers of all races and religions joined. Similarly, the protest religion of Rastafarianism is also said to reflect social and cultural links with Indian migrants to the Caribbean. From the 1900s, India's nationalist leaders began opposing the system of indentured labor migration as abusive and cruel. It was abolished in 1921. Indian entrepreneurs abroad. People need a huge capital to grow food and other crops for the world market. So, for the humble peasant, Shikaripuri Shroffs and Natukotai Chettiars were amongst the many groups of bankers and traders who financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia, using either their own funds or those borrowed from European banks. Indian trade, colonialism, and the global system. Cotton from India was exported to Europe. In Britain, tariffs were imposed on cloth imports. Consequently, the inflow of fine Indian cotton began to decline. Over the 19th century, British manufacturers flooded the Indian market. By helping Britain balance its deficits, India played a crucial role in the late 19th century world economy. Britain's trade surplus in India also helped pay the so-called home charges that included private remittances, home by British officials and traders, interest payments on India's external debt, and pensions of British officials in India. The interwar economy. The First World War, from 1914 to 1918, was fought in Europe, but its impact was felt around the world. During this period, the world experienced widespread economic and political instability and another catastrophic war. Wartime Transformations. The First World War was fought between the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, later joined by the United States, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. The war lasted for more than 4 years and involved the world's leading industrial nations. It was considered the first modern industrial war, which saw the use of machine guns, tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons on a massive scale. During the war, industries were restructured to produce war-related goods. Britain borrowed large sums of money from US banks as well as the US public, transforming the United States from being an international debtor to an international creditor. Post-war economic recovery. Britain, the world's leading economy, faced a prolonged crisis. Industries had developed in India and Japan while Britain was preoccupied with the war. Britain, after the war, found it difficult to recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian market and to compete with Japan internationally. At the end of the war, Britain was burdened with huge external debts. Anxiety and uncertainty about work became an enduring part of the post-war scenario. The US economy recovered quicker and resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. Mass production is one of the important features of the US economy, which began in the late 19th century. Henry Ford is a well-known pioneer of mass production, a car manufacturer who established his car plant in Detroit. The T-model Ford was the world's first mass-produced car. Fordist industrial practices soon spread in the US and were also copied in Europe in the 1920s. The demand for refrigerators, washing machines, and other consumer goods also boomed, financed once again by loans. In 1923, the US resumed exporting capital to the rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. The Great Depression. The period of the Great Depression began around 1929 and lasted till the mid-1930s. Most parts of the world experienced catastrophic declines in production, employment, incomes, and trade. The most affected areas were agricultural regions and communities. A combination of several factors led to the depression. The first factor is agricultural overproduction. The second is, in the mid-1920s, many countries financed their investments through loans from the US. The rest of the world was affected by the withdrawal of US loans in different ways. The US was also severely affected by the depression. Unfortunately, the US banking system collapsed as thousands of banks went bankrupt and were forced to close. India and the Great Depression. Indian trade was immediately affected by the depression. The prices of agriculture fell sharply, but still, the colonial government refused to reduce revenue demands. In those depression years, India became an exporter of precious metals, notably gold. Rural India was thus seething with unrest when Mahatma Gandhi launched the civil disobedience movement at the height of the Depression in 1931. Rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. 2 decades after the end of the First World War, the Second World War broke out. It was fought between the Axis powers, mainly Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy, and the Allies, which included Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the US. The war continued for 6 years over land, on the sea, and in the air. The war caused an immense amount of economic devastation and social disruption. Post-war reconstruction was shaped by 2 crucial influences. The first one is that the US emerged as the dominant economic, political, and military power in the Western world. The second was the dominance of the Soviet Union. Post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods institutions. 2 key lessons were drawn out from interwar economic experience. First, mass production cannot be sustained without mass communication. The second lesson related to a country's economic links with the outside world. The Bretton Woods Conference established the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, to deal with external surpluses and deficits of its member nations. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as the World Bank, was set up to finance post-war reconstruction. The IMF and the World Bank commenced financial operations in 1947. The early post-war years, an era of unprecedented growth of trade and income, was inaugurated by the Bretton Woods for the Western industrial nations and Japan. During this decade, technology and enterprise were spread worldwide. Decolonisation and Independence. After the end of the Second World War, large parts of the world were still under European colonial rule. The IMF and the World Bank were designed to meet the financial needs of the industrial countries. The IMF and the World Bank from the late 1950s shifted their attention more towards developing countries. Most developing countries were not benefited from the fast growth the Western economies experienced in the 1950s and 60s. They organized as a group, the Group of 77 or G77, and demanded a new international economic order, or NIO. NIO meant a system that would give them real control over their natural resources, more development assistance, fairer prices for raw materials, and better access to their manufactured goods in developed countries' markets. The US's financial and competitive strength was weakened due to the rising costs of its overseas involvement from the 1960s. In the mid-1970s, the international financial system also changed, and the industrial world was also hit by unemployment. Multinational corporations began to shift their production to low-wage Asian countries. China became an attractive destination for investment by foreign multinational corporations. In the last 2 decades, the world's economic geography has been transformed as countries such as India, China, and Brazil have undergone rapid economic transformation.